Psalm 112 is the twin of Psalm 111, which we studied yesterday. And in that regard, that is very much the message. Namely, Psalm 112 echoes Psalm 111. Literally, every sentence in Psalm 112 will have at least one word that was used in Psalm 111. But more than that, the structure is the same. They're both psalms that are acrostic for phrases. So the whole alphabet is covered in 10 verses each. But here's the core message. Psalm 111 describes God. Psalm 112 describes a person who is God-fearing. You may recall that was the closing line of Psalm 111. Reshit Chachma Yirat Adonai, the beginning of wisdom is awe of Adonai, a good understanding for all their doings. God's praise stands forever. And so Psalm 112 will now describe who is this person who has wisdom. Who is this person who is Yirat Adonai, a person in awe of God. God in 111 is described as Chanun v'rachum, gracious and compassionate. Yiskor la'olam, who remembers forever. Burito, God's covenant, who is a God of emet, of truth. Samuchim la'ad la'olam, set firmly forever. God is yashar, straight or upright, with the repetition of la'olam, that God is enduring. Both God remembers forever and God is remembering of covenant. And now those same words are echoed in the description of a righteous person. The righteous person is Yashar or Yesharim. Here, the righteous person is Tzaddik. The word Tzaddik will be repeated 4 times in Psalm 112. That is the core, with twice olam, twice la'ad, that quality of enduring, steadfast, forever. And the word that gets repeated 3 times is yireh, fearing, in awe of. And so there is an echo of words and phrases in Psalm 112. Words that were used to describe God are now applied both to the righteous, the tzaddik, in who he or she is, and how God relates to that person. And so without further commentary, to first put up the psalm itself so as to read through these 10 verses and then to go back and show that quality of echo. Happy is the person who has awe of Adonai. Now that phrase, Yirat Adonai, is where we left off yesterday, right? That was that phrase in the final line, Reshit Chachma Yirat Adonai, the beginning of wisdom is awe of Adonai. And now a description of the person who is living Yareh at Adonai, and implying this is a description of a person who has found wisdom. Hallelujah. Happy is the person who has awe of Adonai, who in God's commandments desires abundantly. Mighty upon the earth will be his seed. A generation of the upright will be blessed. Abundance and wealth are in his house, and his righteousness stands forever. Shining in the darkness is a light for the upright, gracious and compassionate and righteous. Good is a person who is gracious and lends, sustaining his affairs with justice. For eternally he will not stumble, for a remembrance everlasting will be a righteous one. From harmful reports he will not fear. His fixed heart trusts in Adonai. Firm is his heart. He shall not be afraid, even before he gazes upon his foes. Distribution he gives to the needy. His righteousness stands forever. His horn shall be raised in honor. The wicked will see and be angry, gnashing his teeth and melting away. Craving of the wicked shall perish. Now, this psalm opens and closes the same way as Psalm 1. And then when we learned Psalm 1 so long ago, I noted that what comes first often foreshadows what will unfold. The opening of Psalm 1, Ashrei Ha'ish, happy is the person, Sherlo Halach Achrei Eitzat Rishaim, who doesn't go after the gatherings of the wicked. Ashrei Ish is the opening, but the closing also of Psalm 1, the last two words of Psalm 1, V'derech Rishaim Toved, and the way of the wicked shall perish. And here the last words are Ta'avat Rishaim Toved, the lusts or the cravings of the wicked shall perish or shall come to naught. And so Psalm 112 is a wisdom psalm. It's a description of Chachma, as was Psalm 1, with the contrast between the righteous and the wicked. Robert Alter will refer to this last line of surprising us with introducing the wicked as a foil. Yeah. I think of it instead as a contrast. And we're starting at the end. The wicked will see, it's not clear what they're seeing, but we may surmise they are seeing the success of the wise person. Successes we'll see that's both material but even more spiritual. The key word that gets repeated over and over is enduring. The righteous has a heart that is firm, that is samuch. The wicked melt away. They are, if you will, transient. Their cravings perish. The contrast is between the wise, marked by living a life in awe of God, with the wicked, who aren't further described here, but they are seen as, again, the opposite, for whom there is anxiety, gnashing of teeth, in contrast to the wise, who we will see is in a state of equanimity, whose lusts are for the mitzvot. The wise, chafetz ma'od. That's kind of, if you will, the envelope. Here, the lusts of the wicked perish or are for naught. And in the opening verse, the desires, the chafetz ma'od, that which is desired abundantly, are for commandments, not for lusts, but for fulfilling the expectations of God. And so that's the point, counterpoint, and somewhat the envelope. Another dimension. And so that is the contrast and the envelope. So now to start from the beginning and share some commentaries. Hallelujah begins the psalm, and one of the contrasts is 4 times Yud He Vav He was mentioned in Psalm 111, and here only twice. Once in terms of the focus, the closing line of Psalm 111 dealt with Yirat Adonai, the awe of God. And so here, that's the beginning. Yireh et Adonai and Ashrei Ish. Such a person not only has chachma, wisdom, but has happiness. Now the word Ashrei has this quality of enduring happiness. Some would use the word contentment in English, but in Hebrew, Ashrei is used for that which is a ongoing state of being, of equanimity. It's not happiness in terms of fun or joy of a moment. It has to do with an inner quality marked by stability. B'mitzvotav, with God's expectations. And again, at the center of yesterday's psalm, literally the middle words were Yiskor le'olam brito, God will remember forever God's covenant. Here, covenant is the response. Mitzvotav are the human responsibilities as part of covenant. That is the desire, to live in relationship with God. Verse 2 begins the rewards. Such a person is first rewarded materially. It's kind of like Maslow, where there's the ladder of needs. And so this psalm, in describing rewards, begins with the physical. Verse 2, the first word. Gibor, mighty, often translated also as a hero, because usually Gibor in the Bible is a word for a military warrior. So it's a word for a warrior, mighty. In fact, the Targum, the translation into the Aramaic, which is a later translation, meaning not clear, 5th to 9th century, will say the mighty is the mighty of Torah, in Torah. That's where the battle is fought, linking it to mitzvot, to the doing of commandments. But this word gibor also can be related to materially successful. It's the word used to describe Boaz in the book of Ruth, chapter 2, verse 1. So as to say, mighty upon the earth can also mean mighty materially, prospering, which continues. His seed, which implies what is the first sought after material gift? Progeny, that you will be blessed with seed, children who will be strong, and all those elements. A generation of the upright will be blessed. And that is ambiguous. That can either refer to the progeny, who will also be upright, or it can refer to the person himself, that he will be blessed by having progeny. Abundance and wealth are in his house, and his righteousness stands forever. So he is financially sound because he has lived a wise, good life. Ibn Ezra will emphasize the relationship between the first part and the second as saying righteousness stands forever, to emphasize that he has obtained his success justly. He hasn't cut corners. He's been honest in how he has become materially successful. Now, verse 4 is the bridge between the physical and the spiritual rewards and description of who he is. Zarach b'choshech or leyesharim. Actually, let me point out one last piece. This last phrase, his righteousness stands forever. That same phrase appears also in verse 3 of Psalm 111 to describe God. So here again, that echo. In verse 3 of Psalm 111, Hod v'hadar pa'alo, glory and majesty is God's activity. V'tzidkato omedet la'ad, and God's righteousness stands forever. The same words are now here used for the tzaddik, the righteous person. His righteousness stands forever. Okay, on to 4, and you'll see an interesting question. Zarach b'choshech, shining in darkness, or la'yesharim, is the light for the upright. Chanun v'rachum, gracious and compassionate, v'tzadik, and righteous. And here's the question. Is verse 4 referring to God bestowing a gift of light, or is it referring to the righteous person? I just shared with you how verse 3 literally has the same phrase, his righteousness stands forever, referring to God, and here is usually understood as referring to the person. And the commentators are divided. Most of them say this is God shining light into the darkness for the upright. And there is a related phrase in the book of Micah 7:8. Ki ashev b'choshech, although I sit in darkness, Adonai or li, God is a light for me. So here, the reward for the righteous is that when all seems dark, there is God's light. But the other way it's understood, like Benjamin Siegel will say, this is the one time, which would be maybe leaning toward the first interpretation, but human beings are never called in the Bible chanun v'rachum, gracious and merciful or compassionate, except Benjamin Siegel says here. Because verse 4 can be read, good as a person. Verse 5. Is verse 4 the beginning of the description of the righteous person, or is it the description of the reward? Now, great poetry is purposeful ambiguity, which is to say, it is probably both for the poet, or at least we can read it as both. And in reading it as both, as not only is how one is rewarded, but how one operates. Namely, verse 4 will say the righteous person shines light for the others who are upright, illuminating their darkness, and doing so because he, the righteous person, not unlike God, is generous. The word chen Chanun is giving, expecting nothing in return. Rachum, compassionate. Rechem, a womb, a motherly, unconditional love. V'tzadik, and righteousness. So the ambiguity of 4 sings to me. It's, again, the power of this psalm to say that the righteous person of Psalm 112, who is the, in creation we're told, Na'aseh Adam b'tzalmenu uchidmotenu. God says, let us make human, Adam, in our likeness and image. Here is being reflected in that likeness and image. Verse 5, Tovish chonenu malveh. And that same word, chanun, chonein, good is a person who is gracious and lends, sustaining his affairs with justice. Now here, lending is a very high level of generosity. In the Bible, you cannot lend for interest. Later, that will be legally defined as only within one's own Jewish community and allow lending to non-Jews, a whole separate conversation. But some people, the rabbis will comment, will not accept gifts, but they will accept a loan with the intent to give it back. And in agricultural time, when the crop was bad, you needed to borrow in order to buy seed, in order to plant, to have a new opportunity. And Maimonides will say the highest level of giving is lending. The highest level of giving is honoring the dignity of a person to lend resources to allow them to become independent. And so good is a person who is gracious and lends. And again, right before the lending is the mindset of graciousness, that same word used to describe God, sustaining his affairs with justice. For eternally he will not stumble. Yimot can mean to collapse, to stumble, to totter. Here the image is you are steadfast eternally. Nothing is eternal except God. That's the word repeatedly used to describe God. But you will have an element of that quality of stability in your own life. For a remembrance everlasting will be a righteous one. And this can be referred to the reward that your name will be sustained. In Proverbs 10:7, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, the memory of a righteous person shall be for a blessing. So your remembrance, because of who you are, as this reflection of God's goodness, will be enduring. And here's equanimity, verse 7. Mishmu'a ra'ah, from a harmful hearing, a harmful report, lo yirah, you will not fear. Now, it's not clear what the report could be about. The report could be either about bad news in the world, but you won't be afraid, or it could be of slander of an enemy. It's left simply being a shmuah, which is to say, nothing will cause you to fear. My teacher, my beloved friend, Rabbi Jack Reamer, is listening in this morning. His dear friend, Rabbi Harold Kushner, wrote a book called Conquering Fear in honor of September 11th. And he emphasized, Rabbi Kushner, that in the Tanakh, the most repeated command and promise is, you shall not fear. You shall not operate from fear. So here, fixed will be your heart because of trust in Adonai. And doubling up on this image of the fixed heart, verse 8, Samuch libo le'olam. And that same phrase is used in verse 8 of Psalm 111, back to mirroring. Samuchim la'ad la'olam, describing God, set firmly forever and ever. Asuyim be'emet v'yashar, they are done in truth and uprightness. That is God's doings. Here, we who follow God's ways, what is the reward? Equanimity, a lack of fear. Our heart will remain unafraid even before he gazes upon his foes. And this is elliptical. Usually translations will throw in a couple words, even before he gazes upon his foes' defeat. He shall not be afraid at all times. With an eye on the clock, the last two verses, and then to pull this together. Pizar means scattering, so distributing. I choose to see this as a noun for flow rather than as two verbs, but it can be understood either as scattering. He gives to the needy, his righteousness stands forever. So scattering has a sense of widely distributing to the needy, la'evyonim. And as we've seen, evyonim is not only financially, but emotionally needy. His righteousness, who's the his? The caregiver, this righteous person, with again this la'ad, the sense of stability, standing forever. His horn shall be raised in honor, either implying, as commentators will say, that he's like a stag, proud, unafraid, with the horns aloft, or it can mean, for other commentators, that he is reaching upward always. So his horn shall be raised in honor toward God. Another name for God is kavod. So his horns are raised reflecting either God's presence or toward God as yearning. And now the closing line, which as we saw in Psalm 111, the last line is often separated from everything else that flowed and then explains everything else before it. Here, this dramatic shift to all of a sudden talking about the wicked, but it explains everything by underscoring the contrast. The wicked will see, with again this possibility of will fear and be angry. That's the nature of the wicked. They will have anger, ka'as. They will gnash their teeth. They will be, uneasy in the world. And implied is what's going to melt away? Their heart. So in contrast to the heart that is steady, enduring of the righteous, theirs melts away. And again, heart is the source of wisdom in the biblical tradition. The heart is where is the mind, being mindful, being heartful. That for them will perish. Their cravings will perish. And again, back to Psalm 1, their way will perish. Which is also to say, potentially, here it's their cravings. Their cravings, and even the word craving is of selfishness. So to pull this together and to get the bigger picture, having looked at the trees, now to look at it overall, the medium is the message, namely, humans have the capacity to be tzaddik, to be righteous. And with that, underneath that, humans have the capacity to be in awe of God, the opening, which allows for being tzaddik, which allows for mirroring the attributes of God. And the attributes of God are generosity and righteousness and justice, generosity that allow for the state of God, namely equanimity eternality and light, both giving and receiving the light, which equals the nourishment of all that is good in life itself. So with that, I am eager to hear some of your reactions to Psalm 112. Commentators will say that it was clearly written after Psalm 111, though I could see the two being written also in tandem as a point counterpoint, with again the middle verse of Psalm 112 being Le'olam lo yimat, for eternally he, the righteous, will not stumble. Reactions and thoughts about Psalm 112. I see Vivian and then Alex. Go ahead, Vivian.
I'm interested in the gracious lending line. I think it's number 5.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes, because you won't mind, as a translator like yourself, I'm always careful of something of a structure like that. Does gracious team with lending in the sense that it explains why you lend? Or is it setting up two things? One, the way God gives absolutely, and I will not deny that I am influenced by the Christian and other senses of grace, but just giving. And he also gives contractually, which is more like lending. He gives us absolutely the fruit from which we make the wine. And he sets up a contract with us, as with Abraham and Isaac, that we expect to fulfill. So I think there I see perhaps a basis for the shift at the very end of the song. Anyway,
as many of us know, Vivian, thank you.
I do not know.
Yeah.
I don't speak Hebrew or read it.
You are a sensitive. You are a sensitive reader and a translator and a teacher of literature. So let me react, Vivian, to your sensitivity of this phrase in verse 5, chonen umalveh, gracious and lends, with the question that Vivian raises: what's the relationship between grace and lending? And I love to go to the middle of what you shared, and that is God is gracious in entering into covenant, and yet it's like lending, in that there's an expectation that the generosity will be returned with faithfulness, with obedience even to the mitzvah. So yes, that's an aspect that I like. Also in your question was, are they paired usually? Chonen umalveh, and I'm not aware of it being a usual pairing, but they are related. And again, chen in Hebrew, like the word grace, giving, expecting nothing in return, and therefore there's this tension between chen, which is an overflow of love, of giving, and yet, back to Vivian's point, it's coupled with malveh, a sense of pay it back. I'm giving it to you only to receive it back. But again, for the rabbis, that's also the highest level of charity. You give when you can give back, that's honoring the dignity of the other. And so that's where giving and graciousness do go together. I will say one more thought that relates to that, and then Alex had his hand up, and that is in verse 9, there's a description not of lending, but of charity. And the opening word is very unusual there, and that is pizar, which I shared means literally to scatter, natan, scatter, give, la'evyonim, to the needy. So that's different than lending, that's giving. And what there is as a commentary to the scattering is a commentary of Maimonides, which is that it is better to give to many 1,000 gold coins to one person each than to give 1,000 gold coins to one person. And he will explain that the goal of giving repeatedly is to inculcate the habit and the mindset of being a giver. And therefore, it's better to do it repeatedly than one big time. And that's a play here in verse 9, Pizar Natan, scattering giving to the needy is his righteousness, and will stand forever. Alex, go ahead. You had a comment.
Yeah. First of all, I'd like to thank you for your interpretation. I think it's spot on. And I also want to note that verse 9, together with verse 5, together with verse 3, seems to be a divine endorsement of Keynesian economics. You keep the money flowing to the through the poor, you yourself will do well by it.
So clearly, there is this notion of on two counts. One, it's the opening, mitzvotav chafetz ma'od. In his mitzvot is one's desire. So one does it as an expression of relationship with God, because back to Psalm 111, God's nature is to be generous. God in verse 5 of 111, food is given to those in awe of God. God is the God who is generous. And so that's part of modeling being like God. But as Alex notes here, and this again has a human audience, the psalm, if you fulfill the word of God, God will be good to you and you will have abundance and wealth. Now, the rabbis, of course, know that not everybody who is good is necessarily wealthy. And all the Psalms, all religious language can, of course, be understood more metaphorically, spiritually, than necessarily materially. Though here, there is clearly the sense of materially, because you have resources to lend, to give, to distribute. And so that's the promise. Keynesian economics, you help the poor, you help yourself. Other comments or reactions? Howard, go ahead.
Rabbi, I must say, it just came to me now as the discussion. I love this idea, this thought, whatever you want to call it, that we have a soul, and God, Adonai, gives us this body for a while. And what is the ultimate gift of the body? To experience this earth, but then it's also taken away.
Yeah.
So we're loaned this body, thankfully, and after a while, that's taken away. So that just a thought that came to me. It's the ultimate loan. The ultimate loan.
So that is the rabbinic tradition, that our bodies are a vessel, that are the container for the soul which is enduring, and the body which is transient. And one other comment in that regard of Howard's, and that's to link it to Alex's previous comment, verse 3, abundance and wealth are in his house, and his righteousness stands forever. And Rabbi David Kimchi, the commentator, will say regarding this phrase, V'tzidkato omedet la'ad, which again is a phrase used in Psalm 111 to describe God in verse 3. Rabbi David Kimchi will say that's the eternal reward. So you're giving reward on this plane materially, and your righteousness will stand forever. Radak will say that points to Olam Haba, the world to come, that what your quality of righteousness is in this world will be the righteousness that will warrant sustaining that which is otherwise transient. The material is transient, the righteousness is enduring. Closing comment, and then we'll hear from our honorees today. So I want to close with an important line, and then we'll hear from Louise and Chuck. And that's the opening and closing of this psalm. The key motif is Yirat Adonai. That was the closing of 10, right? Reshit Chachma Yirat Adonai, the beginning of wisdom is the awe of God. And Psalm 112 has described what it means to be a awer of God, and did so with words that echo the very nature of God. And there is a line from Proverbs. Proverbs, by the way, chapter 31, closes with an acrostic. And as we noted, Psalm 111 and 112 are acrostics. They're alphabetical. And that allows for us to memorize them more easily, for them to be symbolically from A to Z, wholeness. And so Proverbs 31, 10 to 31, each verse begins with one of the alphabet, and the second to last line in describing the model woman is this famous line, Sheker hachein. Graciousness can be a lie, can be deceptive. Graciousness, how a person presents themselves. They can appear generous, but even generosity to a great narcissist is only to fulfill the needs of the narcissist, not genuinely to help. Sheker hachein. It can be deceptive. Hevel hayofi. Beauty can be fleeting or vain, insubstantial. So even graciousness can be deceptive. Appearances of even attractiveness can be insubstantial. Yirat Adonai, now it's describing this model woman, but Yira Adonai, but fear of God, Tit Halal, for that she will be praised. And here's a play on words. Our two psalms begin with the word hallelujah, praise be God. Here, the one who is in fear or awe of God, Tit Halal, she will be praised. Again, an echo to what we and how we celebrate God will be how a person who is in fear of God will be praised. And back to substantiality and insubstantiality. Do not be fooled by appearances, either acts of, even acts of kindness that are self-serving, or beauty, which is also only surface. It's the mindset within of seeing the sense of humility that comes out of awe, that comes out of the wow of creatureliness, and that celebrates belonging and responsibility, that ultimately leads to the goal of a life that is enduring in impact and equanimity when lived, and a feeling of God's light in the darkness, and last, thereby becoming a light for others amidst darkness. with that, Chuck and Luis, some concluding words about your prompts of study. And Chuck, you shared with me this image of Einstein and the ball that I liked when we spoke briefly. But Luis, why don't you start with, and then maybe Chuck, about what the study of Psalms.
I just would like to say, even though with the pandemic, we felt very welcome, and we've enjoyed the different study groups that your synagogue has. And before the pandemic, we enjoyed coming to services. So we're very happy with our move and with our new congregation.
Thank you, Luis.
When we first got here, we were shopping, shul shopping, obviously, and we checked out a few places. And looking back, I don't know what took us so long to decide on CBI.
Oh, thank you.
Mainly the learning experiences. That's the best part.
Thank you.
So, I grew up in San Diego, moved to San Francisco after high school, became an obnoxious San Franciscan, which I'm very proud of. Went to Cal and then went to Oregon State. We met in Hillel. But learning is very important to us. I'm an engineer and I have this compulsive urge to know how things work. And
share with me, Chuck, share with us your image of the ball and Einstein.
Oh yeah, Einstein, he's famous for playing mind games, like riding on a light beam and so on. One of my favorite, he said, let's assume everything you know is in a balloon. And the surface of the balloon represents the interface of things you don't know. You're aware of things you don't know. You just don't know them. If you learn more, the balloon gets bigger. The surface gets bigger and you're more aware of things you don't know. So often when you learn something, I mentioned before, when I went to college, I went to synagogue for the first time, got a book called Festivals of the Jewish Year by Theodore Gaster. And I said, I'll read a book and I'll know about the religion. So I read this book, ended up with more questions than I had before. And now I have more questions than I've ever had. It kind of builds on itself. By the way, an aside about acrostics, Ashrei, why isn't there a nun? That's a homework assignment.
Right? Why did the nun nafal?
Yes,
nafal why did it fall out? And I will add, there is a Dead Sea Scroll that has been found with the nun in the Ashrei. But
I did hear that. Yes.
When we get to Psalm 145, so I want to just pull together before Kaddish to again thank Luis and Chuck for being regulars.
Thank you.
For allowing us to honor you today. And to say that Psalm 111 and 112 are a lovely pair of a description of God's goodness and our potential for goodness. Starting next week, Psalm 113 are the 6 Psalms that constitute Hallel. And I look to begin our preparation for Pesach as we begin with Hallel on Tuesday.